Hello and welcome to today's IBM webinar on conquering compliance drift. I'm Michael Downs. I'm the Chief Technology Officer with Evolving Solutions. We're an IBM mainframe partner, and today I am very pleased to welcome Michael Jordan. He's a distinguished engineer with IBM Security. He has been working on mainframe and with IBM for 30 years, 20 or more years working on development, as well as 5 years in a client-facing role. He's spent a lot of time on security and cryptography, as well as with parallel sysplex, and holds over 20 patents. I'm really excited to have Michael here today. He joined us recently for a conversation on quantum safe computing, and we're going to dive deeper into the Compliance Center today. So before we do that, let me give you a little bit of background on Evolving Solutions. Evolving Solutions is a technology services provider, and our main goal is to help our clients modernize and automate their mission-critical infrastructure. We really do that by helping them adapt the processes in what we think of as modern operations. So modern operations is really an approach to being able to take the disciplines that you already have in your data center and in your existing world, and to adopt new capabilities, new technologies, new processes and procedures that are necessary in order to support a hybrid cloud world that we're all functioning in now, where we have distributed applications across cloud and on-premise. And really there are 4 areas that we're focused on, as well as our core platforms capability. We really focus on data connectivity and access, on pipelines and automation, on observability, and on data protection. And really surrounding all of these things is security. Security has changed very significantly with the introduction of the public cloud. And as that has changed, the mainframe has done a lot of ongoing work to make sure that we're continuing, that the platform is continuing to really provide the security that it's always been known for. Michael and I were talking briefly before the webinar started, and he made a great point, which is we all think of mainframe as secure, and sometimes the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And I think if any one of you have really spent any time with cloud and distributed applications, that's a pretty squeaky wheel when it comes to security. But it's easy to lose sight of the fact that we need to continue to invest in and think about that core security capability that the Z platform provides. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael and let him dive into today's topic.
Great, thank you very much. And just a little bit more about myself. So as Michael said, I'm an IBM Distinguished Engineer, and I am the IBM Z and Linux One Security CTO. And what that means is I'm responsible for security for the entire platform. So from the hardware, so the processor, to the firmware, to the hypervisors, operating systems, and the broader stack. And in that role, I work across the IBM Z team, as well as other parts of IBM, including, research, security, and cloud, in fulfilling that role. So I'm happy to be here today talking about security and compliance. As Michael mentioned last week, we did a talk on the quantum safe and what we've been doing around Z16 and quantum safe. I encourage you, if you're interested in that, to go find that recording and have a look at that or listen to that as well. So let me start off by talking a little bit about how we approach security for the platform. As I said, as the security CTO, I look at the security across the platform. And one of the things that we really look to leverage is the fact that IBM either owns or contributes to a large portion of the stack. And as a result of that, we can, from a security perspective, we can integrate solutions vertically up and down in the stack and horizontally across the stack, as well as identify the most effective place to put specific types of security controls. And we see that as a huge advantage. And when you look at what we've done over the last 3 generations, starting with Z14, we've really looked to leverage this and have gone beyond providing just sort of infrastructure and plumbing for security to providing more end-to-end solutions around security. So with Z14, the focus was on data protection. We introduced, the IBM Z Pervasive Encryption, which was focused on helping organizations protect data in flight and data at rest with a set of capabilities across the stack, including the hardware and the operating systems and the broader software stack. With Z15, we shifted our focus to data privacy and confidential computing, where the pervasive encryption was focused on protecting data in flight and data at rest. The confidential computing is really focused on protecting data in use or data in memory. And with Z16, we had three capabilities that we introduced from a security perspective. We had flexible capacity in the cyber resilience domain. We introduced our quantum safe server. Again, we did a discussion on that, and there is a recording available for that. And then today, we're going to talk about continuous compliance. And with that, let's jump in and get right to it. So when you look at the data from the industry, I think there's three key takeaways, from an industry perspective. First is that doing compliance is, it's expensive and it's complex, and there's quite a bit of uncertainty around doing compliance correctly. But the bottom line is, most organizations can do it better, and actually doing it better can help reduce risk and reduce the cost of breaches. So there is significant value in improving on how we approach compliance and security as part of that. When you look at what a typical audit journey looks like, and this is, we worked and collaborated with our clients in bringing this solution to market, and the feedback that we have here and the challenges that we've identified here come directly from our clients. And when you look at the process, the first step of the process is that there's somebody in an organization that is responsible for reading and understanding regulatory controls. Typically, this is from a chief risk and compliance office, or somebody in your governance organization. But at some point, it's got to get passed down to somebody on the Z team to actually take a look at that and try to map that and translate that into a set of IBM Z and Linux One specific controls, right? And so that's really identified as the first challenge. And one of the reasons behind that is, if you look at a lot of the industry and regulatory standards and mandates, they weren't necessarily written with Z in mind, and there is some interpretation required to kind of figure out what's the right set of controls. And then that's where I think some of the uncertainty comes into play, is have you done that correctly, and will an auditor agree that you've done that correctly? And then once you've done that, then you have to kind of take a look at your system and understand, okay, have I configured and set up my system according to this, and make whatever adjustments are necessary. And then last is, step 5 is, I have to then demonstrate to an auditor that this has been done correctly. And here, the gathering of evidence and pulling all that together can also be, was identified as a challenge, and it can be extremely time-consuming and cumbersome process. And kind of taking a look at that, specifically the challenge on mapping these controls. When I took an extract from PCI DSS 3.2.1, and this is just one specific control, and I'm not going to read through all of this information on here, but the point of this, and this has to do with protecting passwords, right? Looking at this, how do you map this to a set of Z controls, and this is just one of many different controls in the PCI standard. So if you look at doing this on a large scale, you start to get a sense of how complex and labor intensive doing this correctly can be. So how do we keep up with this? So from a interpreting of regulations, the first thing we need to be able to do is understand which regulations and industry standards are relevant to your organization. For most customers, it's not a matter of just a single standard or regulation. In many cases, they're, for organizations that are, in multinational and spanning industries, right? There could be they could be subject to many different regulations, and then on top of that, they probably have their own internal standard for managing security. And so the first step of the process is understanding what that looks like, and then how do you then talking reiterating what we said before is how do you then map them to a set of Z capabilities. And then again, implementing those controls, understanding what capabilities exist on the platform to help you in, achieving those requirements. And then, lastly, collecting and validate the evidence. And this is, when we approach this is really how we took a look at this. So let's kind of take a look at those in turn. So, we're starting from our starting point with the solution. We focused on 3 different standards. The first one is PCI DSS, and it's PCI DSS version 3.2. And why we started with this is, this is broadly applicable, and there's most organizations are either subject to PCI DSS or are referring to it as kind of a de facto standard. And if you look at the industries, it cuts across many different industries. And in addition to that, it is, cuts across many different geographies. So, it made sense to start from here. And then from a federal, the federal sector, we also included the NIST SP 800-53. And this is also, if any of you out there are kind of adhering to DISA STIGs, DISA STIGs are kind of the implementation behind SP 800-53. So if you're familiar with DISA STIGs, this is very much aligned with that. And then the last is the Center for Internet Security benchmarks. And in fact, with the Center of Internet Security benchmarks, if you're familiar with these benchmarks and guidelines, you'll probably recognize that there weren't any benchmarks for either IBM for ZOS or for Linux on Z. As part of this project, we actually have contributed a number of different benchmarks to CIS, and the motivation behind this is, we looked at, from a standards perspective, we looked at some industry standards, we looked at some federal standards, but some organizations want to have a more generic hardening guideline, if you will, for measuring their system, and that's the whole idea behind the CIS benchmarks and why we've introduced those. And you can see the ones on the left here that we've introduced. And if you're interested, you can go to the CIS website and download a copy of those and take a look at those. So the next step of the process is, is implementing these controls. And we're just going to kind of take a look at an example here. This is not, necessarily specific, the actual implementation of these isn't a new capability introduced, but looking at this and looking at compliance holistically, it's important to be able to actually implement, those controls. And in the example that we're looking at here is rendering the PAN unreadable anywhere it's stored. And when you start to kind of drill down and look at what that, looks like, the first step of the process is, anywhere it's stored is, where is the PAN stored? And when you start looking at your ZOS environment, it could be, stored by the application. You could be storing it in a database. In some cases, it could be in, data sets or Linux files. If you're using, Sysplex data sharing and our parallel Sysplex, it could also be in a coupling facility. It could be in a USS file, JES log, so understanding, all the places it exists. And then, having the ability of actually encrypting that, and I think, when we look back at, the capabilities that we introduced in the Z14 timeframe around pervasive encryption, you can see on the right-hand side of this that, we've got a number of capabilities that can be used to help organizations achieve that. So with doing, database encryption or ZOS dataset encryption, coupling facility encryption, tape and disk, and one of the more recently introduced is the ability of encrypting JES spool. And if you want to kind of look at that, right, you can, one of the benefits of these capabilities is you can do that encryption kind of in bulk, and encrypt the data kind of across, your estate, as it's moving from one place to the other. And that was really the focus of what we delivered around pervasive encryption. And so you've done the interpretation, you've done the implementation. Now the next step of the process is how do you collect and validate all of that evidence? And that's where the IBM Z Security and Compliance Center comes into play. This is a new product that we're introducing in conjunction with the Z16. And there's I think 3 key things that this does when we look at compliance. First is it does the heavy lifting associated with that mapping. So as part of the Z Security and Compliance Center, we're providing a set of predefined, what we're calling them profiles, that actually do that mapping of a regulatory, so PCI DSS, NIST SP 800-53, and the CIS benchmarks do the mapping of those standards into a set of technical controls, so you don't have to worry about that. That's all built into and defined in these profiles. And then the next thing it does is it automates the collection and validation of facts against that profile. So basically, when you go initiate a scan, it'll actually go collect all that information and do that validation. And then there's an interactive dashboard that provides a view of what your system configuration looks like as compared to that standard, and gives you the ability of understanding, where you're in compliance and where the tests passed, and where they failed. And then, tying back to what Michael said at the very beginning is, the other key benefit that this capability provides is the ability to identify compliance drift. If we kind of pause here for a second and step back and think about, how you're managing compliance today, more than likely, there's somebody in your organization that has a spreadsheet where they've, done that mapping and mapped, a compliance mandate to a set of technical controls. And then as well, they have to, when an audit occurs, go manually collect all that data and kind of pull it into some kind of a report that is, consumable. More than likely, that process is extremely time consuming, and you're doing it as infrequently as you can possibly get away with, because it's cost prohibitive. But what if you could schedule the collection and validation, these scans, on a periodic basis, where it just goes off and does it, and you don't have to really worry about anything. You can actually identify compliance drift over time and identify whether or not you are managing your environment, according to these standards that we've defined, and as a result, identify if there's points in time where your system is going in and out of compliance, and also understand if you're introducing risk in how you're operating your environment. So I think that's an actual, a really nice, in addition to simplifying, the process and automating the process, having that visibility to how you're managing your system, I think is a vitally important capability. So a little bit more about this, the IBM Z Security and Compliance Center. As I said before, it's a product that we brought to market. It's actually a collaboration across IBM. So this is not just an IBM Z offering. This is a collaboration across IBM Cloud, IBM Security, and IBM Z Systems. And you may, if you've done any webinars, or if you've looked at our IBM Cloud offerings, you may have recognized that there's an IBM Cloud Security and Compliance Center. And the fact that the names are very similar between the IBM Cloud Security and Compliance Center and the IBM Z Security and Compliance Center, that's no coincidence. We've actually worked with IBM Cloud, and there's actually shared technology between the IBM Cloud Security and Compliance Center and the IBM Z Security and Compliance Center. And the whole idea behind that is, looking at hybrid clouds and managing compliance in a hybrid cloud. By working and partnering with IBM Cloud, we're positioning the solution so that we can, interoperate and integrate with the IBM Cloud offering in the future. It's not there today, but we have that ability and flexibility, and with the idea of I can get a view of compliance across a hybrid cloud environment with Z on-prem and whatever workload you're running in the cloud. And then from an IBM security point of view, also recognize that IBM has products like IBM Z Secure, and the suite, and Z Secure Alert and Z Secure Audit. And looking at that solution, we didn't want to have two disjoint solutions. And I'll explain a little bit more about exactly what we've done from an integration point as we get into this a little bit more. So what does this dashboard look like? Because this dashboard is really the main interface, and this is the main touch point for the solution. This is what you're going to be working with. This is what it looks like. And when you look at what's on this screen, we can see that we've done a PCI scan, and at the top we get kind of a summary view of what the scan revealed, and it'll give you the total number of controls that were scanned, and the total that passed and the total that failed. In addition, you can see what the severity of the failures were, and on the right-hand side, that shows you that drift over time that we were talking about earlier. And on the bottom half of the screen, and this actually it will scroll, is the actual profile that we've done the scan for. In this case, we're doing a PCI scan. And if you look at the ID and the description of the controls there, what you'll recognize is this maps one for one to the standard that we're doing a scan for. This is not any Z specific terminology. So if an auditor were coming and look at this, they would recognize the description in there and understand that that's PCI DSS. And if they're looking at any one of these, you can kind of click on them and drill down and understand what's the check that's been done on behalf of that particular control. And it'll tell you, down to here, we looked at this, field and we did this comparison right here. So somebody who knows nothing about Z is able to kind of look at this and understand what's in compliance and what's passed and what's failed without really knowing anything about IBM Z. And in terms of configuration and setup, what you do in here is you come in and you find essentially the scope of the scans that you want to run, and the scope of the scans really just is the systems that you want to include into the scans. And then you can have look at the profiles that are provided. As I mentioned, we have the 3 predefined profiles. You can actually customize and create your profiles where you can add or omit various different checks to those profiles. And again, that's kind of the high level view of it. From an architectural view, we have the IBM Z Security and Compliance Center in the upper left corner. That's the dashboard that we're just looking at. And as you might imagine, it's a modern containerized solution. It's running in Red Hat OpenShift. This can run either on IBM Z16 or IBM Z15. When we first announced this and came to market, it was restricted to IBM Z16. We had a number of clients that came to us and said, I'm really interested in this, but we can't get to Z16 right away. Is there any way we can run this on Z15? And so we've accommodated that and recently announced that it's available as part of IBM Z15. And at the bottom half of the screen, these are the evidence providers. So this could either be Linux on Z, whether it's RHEL, SLES, or Ubuntu, or it can be ZOS. And that's kind of the high level view. Looking at it specifically from a ZOS point of view, how does this work? So when you go into the dashboard and you want to initiate a scan, basically what will happen is it'll go and say, okay, here's all the systems that you configured to be in scope. It'll shoulder tap all of those systems and basically say, hey, go gather all of your evidence. If you look in the middle of the right hand side, you can see all the different places that we're gathering the evidence from. That evidence will be written into a new SMF record. That's an SMF 1154, and the whole idea of that is standardizing the information that we're collecting for compliance. And then common data provider will pump that information back to the Z Security and Compliance Center. Then it will basically ingest all of that data, and then using that profile that we saw before, will basically use that data to do the validation and then show you kind of that report that we just saw on the previous page. A couple other points on here. So one of the components that you'll see on the right hand side is the ZOS Compliance Integration Manager, and it has a little asterisk on there. Why we've called that out, that's actually a portion of Z Secure Audit. So this solution is fully integrated with Z Secure Audit. You can actually kind of think of this as an extension to Z Secure Audit. So it does what Z Secure Audit does, and then provides a user interface around there and provides some additional checking and validation that Z Secure Audit does not do. And if you're an existing Z Secure customer today, there is a way of trading up from Z Secure Audit to the IBM Z Security and Compliance Center, and talk with your IBMer on how to go about that. So that's what it looks like from a ZOS perspective. You might be wondering, well, I have multiple ZOS systems and parallel sysplexes, and when you're configuring the scope, you can configure this to collect data across multiple systems as well as multiple sysplexes. From a Linux on Z point of view, it's very similar. So we have the same, basically collect a very similar set of information. The mechanism is slightly different. Instead of it kind of being a shoulder tap and a push mechanism where the ZOS systems are pushing the data to the Z Security and Compliance Center, this is more of a pull mechanism where the collector in this case actually goes out to those systems, collects the information, and it packages it up and sends it back to the Z Security and Compliance Center to consume it. So kind of, looking at all of this, what are the reasons why you might want to look at the Z Security and Compliance Center? First off, to kind of reiterate, customizable compliance framework. So we have, as I mentioned, profiles built for specific regulatory requirements. These are customizable, so you can actually start with PCI and add some additional goals. So as I mentioned earlier on, there's over 1,000 goals that we've created as part of the solution. So you can start with PCI and add to it. And the whole idea behind this is, you might have to do an audit specifically for PCI, and you'd want to use the actual PCI profile, but you could have you could be managing your environment as a composite of multiple different regulatory standards as well as internal policies. So you could create a profile that is a composite view of the different regulatory standards that apply to you, and then measure your environment to that composite view and saying, are we managing our environment? I've looked at PCI DSS, I've looked at this other one, but let's kind of have a comprehensive view. Or you could add or delete specific checks if you want. As I mentioned before, another benefit of this is the ability of identifying compliance misconfigurations in near real time. So instead of only seeing that you have a problem when you have an audit, you can actually kind of over time if something gets out of line, you can detect that if you run like a daily scan or a weekly scan. You can kind of see when things come out of compliance and correct them all at once versus getting to an audit and realizing that you have a whole bunch of work to do to get ready for that audit. And again, I'll go back to, this from a risk perspective. The whole reason that we have things like PCI DSS and NIST SP 800-53 is, experts have, and the industry collectively has said, okay, here's a good set of best practices to adhere to. It's not strictly about meeting a checkbox. It's really, if you manage your system according to these standards, you're actually reducing risk. And so if you can in real time understand whether or not you're maintaining your system accordingly, again, I think you're helping to reduce risk. And then native evidence writing. So we've actually been working with the various different middleware components to pull their configuration information and providing it directly in SMF records. And the whole idea of this is the authenticity of that information is coming directly from the source. It's not coming from somebody interpreting what that middleware or software component is doing. And then next, we're keeping data on the platform. We've heard from a number of clients that said, hey, I don't want my Z compliance data going into a cloud-based solution. So the IBM Z Security Compliance Center is an on-prem solution where you're maintaining and managing that data. And of course, we already talked about the PCI DSS coverage. And then lastly, I'll say, this will help with changing regulations. I imagine many of you are aware that PCI DSS is, coming out with a PCI DSS 4.0 in the near future. We are already looking at that, and we will be providing, a PCI DSS 4.0 profile. And so if you're using the IBM Z Security and Compliance Center, when we ship that profile, you can actually, do a scan using that profile to understand and assess, what your current posture is compared to PCI DSS 4.0 without really having to do any work, and understand what changes you need to make to be in line with that. And again, the Z Security and Compliance Center positions you for that because we're providing that profile. And just to mention, we're doing a continuous delivery type of a model with this solution, and have a number of enhancements that we're already working on. We talked about the ability of customizing profiles. In the near future, we'll be providing the ability for actually creating custom goals, so that organizations could actually write their own goals that they could include in profiles. And in combination with that, anybody can write their own SMF 1154 records, have that consumed by a custom goal, and incorporate it into the profile. And so the whole idea of this Z Security Compliance Center is that it's a customizable framework that allows you to do audit according to how your organization is managing and needs to manage the environment. So that's what I had for you today. So thank you very much. And with that, Michael, I'll turn it back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate it. I think this is a really great example of what we mean by modern operations. Just the forethought to be able to say, we're going to look at the Cloud Compliance Center, we're going to look at the Z Compliance Center, we're going to pull them together into one place. What we're constantly seeing our clients struggle with is having the resources to be able to track that, regulatory compliance requirement down to actual implementation, and being able to have a framework to do that consistently. Yeah, it's a fantastic solution. Very excited about it.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of interest in it, right? I mean, I think it's resonating with our clients for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's increasingly complex environment makes it even more appealing. So thank you again, Michael. I really appreciate your time today. Anyone watching or listening today, if you'd like to get some more detail on Z Compliance Center or any of the other Z solutions we've talked about in this series, please feel free to reach out to Scott Rudine here at Evolving Solutions at the email listed in the slide here. And we look forward to talking to you and working with you sometime in the near future.